The map was nailed to a cottonwood tree with a single iron spike, flapping in the dry Nevada wind like it had been waiting for someone specific to come along and read it. Elias Underwood had been riding since before sunrise, pushing his bay gelding across the cracked alkali flats east of Carson City, and he was not a man who stopped for much. He was 28 years old, lean in the way that hard work makes a man lean, with sun-darkened skin, and eyes the particular shade of gray that people sometimes called storm-colored, though Elias himself had never much cared what color his eyes were. He had been hired to drive a small herd of cattle from the Barker Ranch to a stockyard in Reno, a job that paid modestly and required very little imagination. The herd was 3 days behind him now, in the capable hands of 2 other drovers, and Elias was riding ahead to arrange the sale and secure a holding pen before the cattle arrived. He had no reason to stop at that tree, and yet he stopped. Something about the map drew him. It was drawn in careful, practiced lines on what appeared to be good quality paper, the kind a person did not waste on frivolous things. The ink was dark and had not yet faded, which meant it had been placed recently, perhaps within the last day or 2. It was not a survey map or anything official. It was a hand-drawn guide, marked with landmarks he recognized. A split rock formation he had passed an hour ago, a dry creek bed, a cluster of Joshua trees, and finally a small square drawn at the end of a winding path, with the word home written inside it in small, neat letters. There were no other words on the map. No name. No explanation. Just the path and the square and that single quiet word. Elias sat on his horse for a long moment and looked at the map. He was a practical man who did not often find himself moved by curiosity or sentiment. But something about that map tugged at him in a way he could not explain and did not bother trying to. He thought about the woman who had drawn it, and he was somehow certain it was a woman, from the careful precision of the lines, the way the letters were formed with intention, and he wondered what had led her to nail a map to a tree on this empty stretch of road. Was she lost herself? Had she placed it for someone who was looking for her? Or had she left it by accident, pinned to the wrong tree altogether? He pulled the map free from the spike, folded it carefully, and tucked it inside his coat pocket. Then he turned his horse off the main road and followed the path. The year was 1873, and Nevada was still a young state, barely 9 years past its rushed admission to the Union during the war. The land out here was not gentle. It was desert scrub and red dust, juniper and sagebrush, the kind of country that made a person feel both very free and very small at the same time. The silver rush had come and gone through parts of it, leaving behind ghost towns and broken promises and men who had stayed on simply because they had nowhere else to go. The railroad had sliced through the center of the state 4 years earlier, and that had changed things, brought goods and people and trouble in equal measure. But out here, east of the city and away from the rail line, it was still the old country, the kind of country where a person could go for days without seeing another human face. Elias followed the map for just under 2 miles. The path wound through a canyon passage so narrow his knees nearly brushed the red stone walls on either side, then opened up into a small valley that felt like something kept secret from the rest of the world. There was a creek running through it, actual water, clear and cold-looking in the afternoon heat, and cottonwood trees along its banks. At the far end of the valley, set back against the canyon wall, was a cabin. It was well made, with a real plank door and a glass window, and a vegetable garden running along the south wall that spoke of someone who had been here for more than a season. He also noticed, with a feeling that settled in his chest somewhere between unease and admiration, that the garden was extraordinarily well tended. There were beans and squash and what looked like herbs in careful rows, and someone had built a small irrigation channel from the creek to the garden using flat stones. It was ingenious, practical work. His horse walked forward, and as he came closer, the cabin door opened. Florence Hawthorne stepped out onto the small porch with a rifle in her hands, held level and steady, her eyes sharp and watchful. She was 26 years old, though Elias would not learn that for some time, and she was tall for a woman of the era, with dark auburn hair that was pinned up in a way that suggested it had been more carefully arranged that morning, and had come somewhat undone through the course of the day. Her dress was practical, deep brown cotton with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and there was flour on her left forearm that she had clearly forgotten about. Her eyes were brown, the warm particular brown of creek water in autumn, and they were looking at him with an expression that was not fear but was absolutely not welcome either. "You are on private land," she said. Her voice was clear and steady, not loud, just certain. Elias raised both hands, his reins looped over one wrist. "I mean no harm, ma'am. My name is Elias Underwood. I found a map nailed to a cottonwood tree about 2 miles back on the main road, and I followed it here. I thought someone might be in need of help, or I might be returning something that was misplaced." He reached into his coat with 2 careful fingers and produced the folded map. Florence looked at the map in his hand, and something happened to her expression. It was not quite alarm, not quite relief. It was the look of a person recalibrating rapidly against information they had not anticipated. "I drew that map," she said, slowly lowering the rifle. It did not leave her hands entirely, but the barrel was no longer pointed at his chest, which Elias considered an improvement. "I drew it 2 days ago, and I intended to nail it to the post at Harker's Junction for my brother. He was supposed to come find me." "That tree was not at any junction I know of," Elias said. "No," she said, and something flashed across her face that might have been embarrassment or might have been frustration with herself. "I stopped to water my horse on the way to town, and the wind took it right out of my saddlebag. I assumed it was gone." She paused. "I went back to the junction and put up a new one. So your brother will still find you, if he comes." There was something in those 3 words that carried a weight she did not elaborate on, and Elias was a man who recognized the sound of a person not saying the whole of something. He did not press. He looked at the map in his hand one more time, then stepped down from his horse. "Would it be all right if I watered my horse?" he asked, "and perhaps rested a spell before I ride on? I have business in Reno, and I am not in a particular hurry." She studied him for a moment. The rifle was still in her hands. He stood still and let her look, because he understood that a woman alone in remote country had every right to look carefully at a stranger who had followed a map to her door. "There is a trough by the east wall," she said finally. "You can water your horse. I will put coffee on." It was not quite an invitation, and it was not quite a dismissal, but he understood it for what it was, a cautious opening. He led his horse to the trough, which was filled with cool creek water, and while the bay drank, he pulled his hat from his head and ran a hand through his dark hair and looked at the valley around him. It was, he thought, one of the most beautiful places he had ever seen in his life, and he had ridden through most of the West. Inside the cabin, Florence moved to the iron stove and set the coffee pot on with hands that were steadier than her heartbeat. She did not know what to make of the man outside. He was broad-shouldered and quiet, with a directness in his eyes that she associated with men who meant what they said. He had made no threatening move. He had announced himself honestly. He had returned the map she had thought was gone. She was not naive about the dangers of her situation. She had come to this valley 8 months ago, following a claim to land that had belonged to her late father, and she had built a life here by herself through equal parts stubbornness and competence. She had dealt with prospectors who had wandered onto her property, a land agent from Carson City who had tried to purchase her deed for far less than it was worth, and 2 men who had decided that a woman living alone was an easy target and had discovered otherwise at the business end of that rifle. She was not foolish. But something about this particular man, the way he had waited at her gate, the way he had held up both hands immediately, the careful way he had produced the map as if it were something worth preserving, told her he was not in any of those categories. She told herself that her instincts could be wrong and kept the rifle within arm's reach. When he knocked at the open door, she waved him in without turning from the stove. He ducked slightly under the door frame and removed his hat, and she heard him look around the cabin, the way people always did, trying to understand a person from their space. What he saw, though she did not know this, made him revise his impression of her upward considerably. The cabin was small, but it was not sparse in the way of a rough frontier dwelling. There were shelves of books along one wall, real books, not a Bible and a farming almanac, but actual literature. There was a work table against the south window covered in papers and what appeared to be technical drawings. There was a microscope. There was a collection of geological specimens arranged on a shelf with careful hand-lettered labels. There were dried herbs hanging from the ceiling in neat bundles, and a pressed flower collection pinned to a board near the window, each specimen labeled in the same precise hand as the map. "You are a scientist," he said. It came out as a statement rather than a question, and it surprised him because he had not meant to say anything. Florence turned around and looked at him. "I am a naturalist," she said. "There is not much formal distinction made between the two at present, but I find naturalist more honest about what I do." She set 2 tin cups on the rough table and poured the coffee. "Please sit, Mr. Underwood, if you intend to stay for coffee." He sat. He wrapped both hands around the cup because the afternoon was cooling rapidly in the valley and the coffee was very good, far better than camp coffee, which was what he had been drinking for the last 2 weeks. "What brought you all the way out here?" he asked. "If you don't mind my asking." "I do not mind." She sat across from him, her own cup held in both hands. "My father, James Hawthorne, was a surveyor. He worked for the Nevada Territorial Survey before statehood. He spent years mapping this region, and in the process he found this valley and filed on it. He meant to retire here." She paused. "He died 3 years ago. He left the claim to me. And you came to work it." "I came to continue his work," she said. "There are species of plants and insects in this valley that have not been formally documented. The rock formations here are unusual. This entire canyon system is a scientific record of something that happened millions of years ago, and no one has properly studied it." She said this matter-of-factly, not with apology or hesitation, in a way that told Elias she was used to explaining herself to people who found the idea strange, but that she had long since stopped caring whether they found it strange or not. "That sounds like a life's work," he said. "It is meant to be," she said. "And your brother was supposed to come help you." The light in her eyes shifted just slightly. "My brother Thomas was supposed to arrive 6 weeks ago. He wrote to say he was coming. He has not come, and his last letter was in April." She looked at her coffee. "I have written to our cousin in Sacramento who had contact with him, but I have received no reply as yet. The mail out here is not reliable." "I am sorry," Elias said, and meant it. "I am managing," she said, and he believed her completely, looking at the evidence of that management all around the cabin. But he also heard under those words what she was too composed to say directly, which was that she was worried, and that worrying alone was its own particular exhaustion. They drank their coffee in a silence that was not uncomfortable. Elias looked at the geological specimens on the shelf, and Florence watched the window, where the late afternoon light was turning the canyon walls amber and rose. "I should ride before dark," he said eventually, standing. "Thank you for the coffee, Miss Hawthorne. It was the finest I have had in 2 weeks of camp cooking." "You are welcome," she said, standing too and following him to the door. "Mr. Underwood, thank you for returning the map. And for coming to check if someone needed help." She paused. "Most men would have left it on the tree." "Most men would have," he agreed, putting his hat back on. He stepped out onto the porch and turned to look at her. The valley behind him was going golden in the last of the day's light. "I hope your brother comes soon." "So do I," she said. He rode out of the valley and back through the canyon passage and onto the main road, and he was 3 miles toward Reno before he realized that he had not thought about the cattle sale once in the entire time he had been with her. He made it to Reno the next morning, conducted his business at the stockyards, met the incoming herd, oversaw the sale, collected his pay, and then spent 2 days doing the things that men who had been on the trail for 2 weeks did in a town like Reno in 1873. Had a proper bath, slept in an actual bed at a boarding house, ate 3 full meals a day, and sat in a saloon in the evenings nursing one drink over 2 hours because Elias Underwood was not much of a drinker. He played a little cards. He mended his gear. He wrote a letter to his older sister in Colorado and posted it at the telegraph office. And on the 3rd day, he found himself looking at the road south and east, back toward the Alkali Flats, and thinking about a map and a valley and a woman who was worried about her brother. He had no legitimate reason to go back. He went back. He told himself on the ride out that he was going to pass through on his way to the Barker Ranch anyway, which was not entirely untrue, though it was certainly not the most direct route. He told himself that he was going to inquire whether she had had any word of her brother, which was a kindness that anyone might extend. He told himself he was simply a man who finished what he started, and he had not quite finished talking to Florence Hawthorne. He arrived at the cottonwood tree on the main road at mid-morning, and there was a new map nailed to it, identical to the first. He stopped and looked at it for a moment without touching it. Her brother might yet come, and he should leave this one for him. He rode on into the canyon and arrived at the valley as the sun reached its peak, and found Florence Hawthorne standing waist-deep in the creek with her boots off and her dress pinned up above her knees, apparently examining something in the water with complete absorption. She did not hear him at first, and he stayed at the edge of the creek and watched her for a moment, not with any improper intention, but simply because the sight of her was so entirely herself, not performing, not arranged for company, just entirely present in whatever she was doing. "There is a new species of caddisfly larvae in this section of the creek," she said, without looking up, and he realized she had heard him after all. Or possibly a new genus. "I am not yet certain." "I would not know a caddisfly from a trout," he said. She looked up at him then, and there was a warmth in her expression that had not been there when he had first arrived, replaced by something that acknowledged he was, apparently, welcome to return. "Mr. Underwood, Miss Hawthorne, any word from your brother?" "Nothing yet." She waded to the bank and began pulling her boots back on with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who had long since abandoned self-consciousness about such things. "I did not expect you to come back." "I am riding past on my way to the Barker Ranch," he said. "The Barker Ranch is north of the Carson Road," she said, and there was a very small smile at the corner of her mouth. "It is not in this direction at all." He was quiet for a moment. "I brought supplies from Reno," he said, and reached back to the canvas bag tied to his saddle. "Salt, flour, and coffee, and there is a package of paper there too, the kind that looked like what you used to draw your map." She looked at the bag and then at him, and the small smile became something fuller and less guarded. "That was thoughtful," she said. "Thank you." He stayed 3 days that time. It began practically enough. He found a section of the irrigation channel that had been damaged by a rock fall, and he repaired it, which took the better part of a morning. She showed him the geological formations in the canyon walls, tracing with her finger the bands of color that told the story of ancient seas and volcanic events, and the grinding of tectonic plates across an impossibly long scale of time. He had never thought much about the age of the earth, but listening to her explain it, looking where she pointed, seeing it all written there in the striped rock right in front of him, he felt something shift in the architecture of how he thought about the land he had been riding across his whole life. "I always figured this country was just here," he said, sitting on a ledge of red sandstone while she sketched the formations in her notebook. "It was always here," she agreed, not looking up from her sketch. "It just took a very long time to become this particular version of itself. Like most things worth knowing," he said, and then felt slightly embarrassed by how much that sounded like something, so he looked away at the canyon horizon. Florence kept drawing, but he caught the corner of her mouth and thought she might be smiling again. In the evenings, he made camp by the creek rather than in the cabin, which was proper and appropriate, and also meant he lay awake longer than he usually did. listening to the water and the night sounds of the valley, and thinking about the way she talked about the things she loved, which was without performance or apology, with a directness that he found more compelling than anything he could quite account for. On the second evening, she brought a pot of stew down to the creek, and they ate together in the last of the light. And she asked him about himself with the same honest curiosity she brought to everything. He told her about growing up in Missouri, the youngest of 4 children of a farmer who had not had enough land or luck for 4 children to live decently on, so 2 of them had gone west. His older sister Rachel had married a cattleman in Colorado and was happy there. He had drifted into cattle work at 16 and had been doing it since, moving with the seasons, working for various outfits from Texas to California. He was good at it, he said without false modesty, and there was always work. But he had been thinking lately about what came after riding, what a man did when his knees had been in the saddle long enough. He had not come to any conclusion yet. "What would you want," she asked, "if you could choose anything at all without worrying about what was practical?" No one had ever asked him that question in quite that way, and the honesty of it deserved an honest answer. He thought for a moment, looking at the valley in the dimming light, the creek running silver in the dusk, the canyon walls going dark red and then deep purple. "Something that stays in one place," he said. "Something I built, something real." He paused. "I have been moving since I was 16 years old. I think I am ready to stop somewhere." "This valley," she said quietly, "has that quality. It makes you want to stay." "Yes," he said, and he was looking at her when he said it, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the night sounds of the valley came in around them like a held breath. On the third day, a rider came through the canyon passage. He was a young man, maybe 19 or 20, with Florence's same auburn hair and a badly bruised face that told a hard story even before he began to tell it. He pulled up short when he saw Elias, who was splitting wood by the cabin wall, and looked between Elias and Florence with wide eyes. "Thomas," Florence said, and the word came out with so much relief and so much emotion packed into it that Elias set down his axe and quietly moved to the other side of the yard to give them room. He heard enough to understand what had happened. Thomas Hawthorne had been robbed on the road from Sacramento, horse, money, luggage, and all. He had spent nearly 2 months working in Virginia City to earn enough for a horse and supplies to finish the journey. He was apologetic and ashamed, and Florence was hugging him hard enough that he had clearly given up on trying to finish his explanation until she let him go. Elias arranged to sleep in the small linta behind the cabin that night, which the family used for storage, and gave Thomas the bedroll by the fire. It was the right thing to do, and he did it without being asked. Thomas, who turned out to be 20 years old and sharp-minded in the same way his sister was, found him there in the morning and looked at him with frank assessment. "How long have you known Florence?" he asked. "About a week," Elias said, "give or take. Are you courting her?" Elias considered this question carefully because it deserved consideration rather than reflex. "I have not asked permission to court her," he said. "I have not asked hers or yours. I came back to check she was all right, and I have been making myself useful." He met the younger man's eyes. "I would not pursue anything without her knowing my intentions plainly and agreeing to them freely. That is the only way I know how to go about such things." Thomas looked at him for another moment and then nodded, apparently satisfied with something in the answer. "She has not had many people in her corner," he said. "Our father died and our mother before that. She has been largely on her own for a long time." "I know," Elias said. "She told me." "Then you understand why I am asking." "I understand exactly why you are asking," Elias said, "and I think the better for you for asking it." He rode out that morning, because he had been 3 days already, and his presence was beginning to mean something that needed to be addressed honestly before it continued. He rode to Reno, where he called on a man named Preston who ran the biggest cattle operation in the county, and arranged 6 weeks of work driving Preston's herd east to a holding station near Elko. It was good work, solid work. the kind that paid well enough to begin saving against the possibility of a future that might require roots. The weeks in the saddle gave him a great deal of time to think. The western plain in late summer was all sage and heat shimmer, and the occasional antelope standing like a statue against the horizon. And in that wide space, Elias Underwood did some of the most honest thinking of his life. He thought about what he wanted, and whether it was fair to want it. He thought about a woman who pressed flowers and named insects and stood in creeks in the early morning without a moment of self-consciousness. He thought about a valley that made you want to stay. He wrote to Florence from Elko, a letter that took him 3 evenings to get right, which was 2 evenings longer than anything he had ever written in his life. He told her he had been thinking about the conversation by the creek, and that he was not a man who spoke about feelings easily or well, but that he thought she deserved to know that his returning to the valley had not been accidental in the way he had tried to make it sound, and that if she had any interest in him coming back with more honest purpose, he would be glad to know it, and if she did not, he would respect that completely and she would not hear from him on the subject again. He posted it and then spent 2 weeks not thinking about whether she would write back, which was to say he thought about nothing else at all. Her reply found him in Elko a week before he finished the drive, passed along by the Preston Outfit's forwarding address. It was written on the good paper he had brought her from Reno, in the same precise, careful hand as the map. It was not a long letter. It was 3 paragraphs, but it was very clear. She wrote that she had thought about it also, and that she was not in the habit of waiting for things she wanted when they were within reach of wanting honestly. She wrote that she had enjoyed his company more than she had enjoyed almost anyone's in a long time, and that she had wondered herself whether he would come back. She wrote in the 3rd paragraph, in a slightly different and more tentative tone that suggested she had almost not included it, that the valley was large enough for 2 people to work without getting in each other's way, and that she had been thinking about whether a naturalist and a cattleman had more in common than either might initially suppose, given that both spent their lives learning the land by being in it. He read that paragraph 4 times. He finished the drive, collected his pay from Preston, stopped in Reno long enough to bank most of it and purchase a few things that a man needed if he was going to present himself seriously at a woman's door, and then rode south and east toward the canyon country. It was October now, and the valley had changed. The cottonwood trees along the creek had gone gold, and the creek itself was running fuller with the early autumn rains that had come through. The garden had been harvested, and the south wall of the cabin had a new stack of firewood that was impressively large for what 2 people could cut in a season. Thomas Hawthorne, Elias discovered, had thrown himself into preparing the property for winter with the same focus his sister brought to everything, and the 2 of them together had accomplished more in 6 weeks than most small operations managed in a season. Florence was at her worktable when he arrived, examining something through her microscope, and Thomas was nowhere visible, which Elias suspected was not entirely accidental. She looked up when his shadow fell across the window, and there was a stillness to her face that was not quite composure, was in fact the opposite of composure held very carefully in place by the force of habit. "You came," she said. "I said I would," he said from the door. "Yes," she said, "you did." He came inside and set his hat on the table and looked at her and said what he had been thinking about for 6 weeks riding across Nevada, stripped of everything except the essential truth of it. "I am not a man who makes declarations easily," he said, "but I think you already know that. What I can tell you is that I have not stopped thinking about this valley or about you since the first day I rode into it, and I would like to stay if you will have me. Not in a temporary way. I mean permanently. I mean I would like to build something here with you if that is something you want. And if it is not, I will leave and not bother you again." Florence looked at him for a long moment. The microscope was forgotten. The October light came through the window and lit the side of her face. "That is a very direct thing to say," she said. "I have been composing it for 6 weeks," he said. I did not want to waste any of it being indirect. She stood up from her work table and crossed the small cabin and stood in front of him, close enough that he was very aware of how near she was, and she looked up at him with those autumn-colored eyes and said, "I would very much like that, Elias." He had been hoping for something like that, and yet hearing it still managed to rearrange something in his chest. He took her hand, carefully, and she let him, and they stood there for a moment in the cabin full of books and specimens and pressed flowers while the cottonwoods went gold outside the window, and neither of them said anything else, because there was nothing else that needed to be said quite yet. Thomas came back from the creek an hour later, and found them sitting at the work table with her geological drawings spread out between them, Elias asking questions and Florence explaining, both of them talking at the same time and then laughing about it. And he stood in the doorway for a moment with a bucket of water in each hand and a look on his face that was equal parts relief and satisfaction before he walked in and set the water down and said, as if nothing of particular note had happened, that he had caught 3 trout and was going to cook them for supper if someone wanted to start the fire. The winter that year came early and hard to the canyon country, which suited all 3 of them in different ways. The snow closed the canyon passage for weeks at a time, and the valley became its own sealed world, white and blue and the dark green of the junipers against the canyon walls. Thomas turned out to have a remarkable talent for repair work and improvisation that made him invaluable to the operation of the property, and he and Elias worked well together in the way that men do when they are neither competing nor resentful, but simply both trying to accomplish the same thing. Florence worked through the winter on her documentation of the valley's natural history. She had by now accumulated enough material for a proper scientific paper, and she spent the long winter evenings writing and organizing, sometimes reading passages aloud to Elias when he was the only other person still awake by the stove, and he listened with genuine attention and asked questions that were, she told him once, better than the questions she got from most of the scientific correspondence she wrote to, who asked things that showed they had not quite read what she wrote. "I read what you write," he said. "I know," she said. "That is what I mean." They were not yet courting in the formal sense. There had been no official declaration, no meeting with anyone external, no arrangement discussed. But in the small world of the valley, they had come to occupy a space beside each other that was becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish from what a future together would look like. He sat with her in the evenings. He knew how she took her coffee. She knew that he slept badly in small enclosed spaces and had quietly moved his bedroll to the lean-to, even after it was cold enough that she had expressly said the lean-to was not suitable for habitation. And he had made it suitable for habitation because he was the kind of man who fixed the things that needed fixing. In February, during a brief thaw, a man arrived at the valley on a hired horse from Carson City. He was a land agent named Clifford Reese, middle-aged and expensively dressed for the frontier, which meant his coat was clean, and he had a document case under his arm and the expression of a man who had made many transactions of a type he considered the natural order of things. He introduced himself politely and stated his business without preamble. He represented a mining syndicate out of San Francisco that had identified the Canyon Valley as a location of potential mineral interest, specifically silver-bearing ore in the canyon walls. He produced papers from the document case and laid them on the porch railing and explained, in a tone of careful reasonableness, that the syndicate was prepared to make a very good offer for the land and that Miss Hawthorne would find herself very comfortable on the proceeds. Florence listened to all of this with her arms folded and her expression neutral. "The claim was filed by my father in 1865, she said when he finished. "It is legally and fully mine. I'm not interested in selling." Reese shifted his weight. "Miss Hawthorne, the syndicate has considerable resources and influence in the territorial courts. Then they may spend those resources explaining to the territorial courts why a valid land claim should be overturned in their favor. she said, "and they will find that explanation more difficult than they anticipate." Elias had come around the side of the cabin during this exchange and stood at the edge of the porch. He did not say anything. He simply stood there, and he was a large, solid man in work clothes with an expression that communicated, without any particular aggression, that the conversation had ended. Reese looked at Elias, looked back at Florence, looked at his documents and seemed to recalculate. "The offer will remain open," he said, and put his papers back in the case. "It will not be accepted," Florence said pleasantly. "I hope your ride back to Carson City is comfortable." After he had gone, Thomas came out from the cabin where he had been listening from the window and said, "Do you think he will come back?" "The syndicate might send someone else," Elias said. He looked at Florence. "You should write to an attorney in Carson City, someone who knows land law, just to have the claim formally reviewed and confirmed. It will cost money, but it will cost less than a legal fight." "I know a man in Carson City," Florence said. "He worked with my father. I will write to him." She looked at Elias and then, with a directness that was very much her, said, "Thank you for standing there." "I did not do anything," he said. "You let me handle it," she said. "And then you were there." "That is not nothing." He looked at her for a moment and then said quietly, "No, I suppose it is not. Spring came to the valley like a gift." The creek ran high with snowmelt. The cottonwoods leafed out in brilliant green, and Florence found 17 specimens she had not previously documented, including what she was increasingly confident was a new species of beetle that she planned to name for the valley. She wrote 2 papers through the spring and sent them to a scientific publication in San Francisco, and the response came back in June. Both were accepted, which was notable because female naturalists publishing scientific work in 1873 were not common, and the editor's letter, while not entirely gracious, was at least honest enough to say the work was excellent, and that was what mattered. Elias had begun, through the winter and into spring, to develop something of a plan. He had savings from 3 years of cattle work, added to by the Preston Drive, and he had been in correspondence with a man in the Carson Valley who ran a small horse breeding operation and was looking to take on a partner who knew cattle work and could help expand the operation. The man's name was Gideon Walsh, and his proposition was solid. Elias had ridden out to look at the property in March and come back thoughtful. He did not want to go anywhere. That was the difficulty. He had made peace over the course of the winter with the fact that the valley was home in a way no place had been since he was a child, and that the person who lived in it was the specific gravity that held him there. But Florence's work was here. Her father's claim was here. The scientific record she was building was here. He could not ask her to leave. What he could do, he thought, was build something that could exist here. He had been looking at the wider canyon system, which included several adjacent valleys that Thomas had explored in the fall. There was enough water and grass for a small cattle and horse operation if it were managed intelligently. Not the scale of the Barker Ranch or the Preston outfit, but something that a man and a woman could run together without destroying the land they were running it on, which was more than could be said for most operations of the era. He had not said any of this to Florence yet, because he had not figured out how it fit together with the other thing he needed to say to her, which was the most important thing, and which he had been building toward for months with all the care of a man who was not accustomed to his heart being on the outside of him. He waited until a June evening when the valley was its most unreasonably beautiful, the evening air warm and golden and smelling of sage and the creek, and Florence had come down to the water to sit after supper in the way she sometimes did, with her notebook, though she was not writing in it. He sat beside her. They had been sitting beside each other in the evenings for months, and it had become its own language, that sitting, easy and known and full of everything they did not need to say out loud because it was already understood. "I have been thinking about something," he said. "I can usually tell," she said, not unkindly. "You get a particular quality of silence when you are thinking about something important. Is that unflattering?" "No," she said. It is one of the things she paused and then finished it cleanly the way she did everything. It is one of the things I like about you. You think before you speak. He was quiet for a moment because she had said that and he wanted to hear it settle. Then he said, I have been looking at the canyon system to the north and east. There is more land there than you have been able to use by yourself. There is water and grass that is not being used at all. She was listening. A small cattle and horse operation, he said. Not large, sustainable. Something that could support 2 people and eventually more. It would not interfere with your work. The scientific territories are in this valley and to the south. The grazing land is separate. He paused. I have the savings to start it and I know the work. That is a very practical thing to propose, she said carefully. I have not finished, he said. She looked at him. Florence, he said, her name in his mouth without the formal prefix the first time he had said it that way. I want to marry you. That is what I am asking. The land and the cattle and the planning, none of that matters if you are not in the center of it. I want to build a life here with you in this valley on this land your father loved. I want to come home to you. I want you to, he stopped and then started again. I am not good at this, but I mean every word of it. Florence had gone very still. The notebook was closed in her hands. The creek ran past them, catching the last of the light. Elias, she said, and her voice had something in it he had not quite heard before, something that had come down from behind the composure that she wore as naturally as most people wore their skin. I have not let myself think too carefully about what I wanted this to become. I was afraid to. She turned to look at him fully, and her eyes were bright in the evening light. I have not trusted many people. I have not had the opportunity or the reason. You returned a map that most men would have left on the tree, and you came back to a valley most men would have ridden past, and you stood on my porch without saying a word and let me handle my own business and then were there when I turned around. Her voice was steady but only just. You are the most decent man I have ever met, Elias Underwood. And I have been in love with you since somewhere around February, if you want the truth of it. He reached out and took her hand, the way he had on the day he had come back in October, but differently now, with the full weight of everything he meant. Is that a yes? He asked. That is a yes, she said, and she was laughing a little, which was the best thing he had ever seen. He leaned down and kissed her there by the creek in the last of the June evening light, the cottonwoods rustling above them, the valley wrapped around them like a held breath that had finally, fully let itself go. Thomas, who was watching from a distance with the tact of a young man who had understood what was happening approximately 3 months before either of them admitted it, turned and went back to the cabin and put the coffee on, and did not say anything when they came back across the grass a while later. Both of them with the particular quality of altered light about them that people have when something significant has just happened to them. He just poured 3 cups and set the sugar on the table and said, I think the creek is running higher than usual tonight. I think so too, Florence said, and looked at Elias across the table, and Elias looked back at her, and Thomas stirred his coffee and decided that 3 months of practiced diplomacy had been entirely worth it. They were married in September, in Carson City, in a small civil ceremony at the courthouse, because the nearest church was 20 miles further than they wanted to travel. Elias' sister Rachel came from Colorado with her husband and their 2 young sons, a journey that took 8 days by train and stage, and she cried from the moment she arrived because she had never seen her brother look the way he looked, which was, she told Florence later, like a man who had come home, which was something she had feared he might never quite manage. Florence wore a dress she had made herself in a deep rose color, which was not the conventional white but was Florence, and Elias thought she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen in his life, and said so that morning in the lobby of the hotel where they were staying the night before the ceremony, very quietly just for her, and she had looked at him with those warm brown eyes and said he was biased. Completely biased, he agreed. Does that change whether it is true? She had taken his hand instead of answering. Thomas served as witness, and Rachel's husband Garrett served as the second. The judge was a compact man named Caldwell who had performed perhaps 100 such ceremonies, and had nonetheless a warmth about him that made this one feel particular. He said the words, and Elias and Florence said the words back, clearly, looking at each other. And when he pronounced them married, Rachel made an audible sound and then covered her mouth. And Thomas looked at the ceiling in the way that young men look at ceilings when they are trying not to be visibly emotional. And Elias held Florence's face in both hands and kissed her in the courthouse, with the September sunlight coming through the tall windows. They spent 2 days in Carson City before returning to the valley, and those 2 days were their honeymoon, which was a luxury neither of them had expected in any grand sense, but which was perfect in all the ways that mattered. A proper room at the city's best hotel, dinners at a restaurant that served actual beef and vegetables in the same meal, an evening at a small theater where a traveling company performed a production of something theatrical enough that Florence spent half of it writing observations in her notebook, and Elias spent half of it watching her write, completely content. On the ride back to the valley, they stopped at the cottonwood tree where the map had been, where the iron spike was still there, empty now. Elias touched the spike briefly and looked at Florence. "I should thank whoever made you pin the map to the wrong tree," he said. "I pinned it to the wrong tree because I stopped to water my horse at the wrong place and did not pay attention," she said, and there was a laughter in her voice that she was not quite suppressing. "It was not fate, Elias. It was carelessness." "Carelessness that changed my life completely," he said. "I will take it." She looked at the spike, and then at him, and then she reached up and kissed him, right there on the road in the September afternoon, which was something she did now with a freedom that still managed to surprise him every time, not with hesitation or restraint but with her full self, because Florence Hawthorne did everything that way. They returned to the valley and began the work of building what they had planned. The first year of marriage was the kind of year that shows a person who they have actually married, as opposed to who they thought they were marrying, and for both Elias and Florence it was a revelation of the right kind. She was stubborn in ways he had known and also in ways he had not anticipated. She could become so absorbed in a piece of scientific work that she forgot to eat for a full day, and then was unreasonably irritable for reasons she refused to attribute to hunger until he put food in front of her, at which point she ate everything and recovered her temper entirely. He was sometimes too quiet when she needed him to say something, and she had to learn the specific distinction between Elias being quiet because he was thinking and Elias being quiet because he was troubled, and how to draw the second kind out without alarming the first kind. These were not large difficulties. They were the normal necessary work of learning to share a life with another person, and they were both disciplined and honest enough to do that work without drama. The land proposition Elias had described proved out in practice. By the following spring, he had purchased 12 head of cattle and 4 horses, and had arranged a working partnership with Gideon Walsh that allowed him to run the cattle on the expanded canyon land without overgrazing any of it. He had a talent for reading land that Florence said was not so different from what she did learning, to understand a place from what it showed you if you paid attention. Thomas, who had turned 21 that winter, had begun to talk about his own plans. He had a restlessness that was different from his sister's rootedness, a desire to see more of the country before he settled anywhere, and Elias understood it because he had been the same. He helped Thomas find a position with a survey party heading into Utah Territory in the spring, and Florence saw him off at the canyon passage with a thoroughness of farewell that suggested she was both proud of him and aware that the valley would be quieter without him. "He will come back," Elias said, standing with his arm around her as Thomas's horse disappeared into the canyon. "I know," she said. "He is a Hawthorne. We always come back to this valley eventually." The letter from Florence's scientific paper had produced an unexpected correspondence. The San Francisco publication had forwarded her address to a professor at the newly established University of California, a man named Dr. Emil Hartmann, who ran the natural history program and who had read Florence's papers with what he described as considerable excitement. He wrote to ask if she would consider contributing to a larger survey project of Nevada's geological and biological character, which would involve exchanging specimens and detailed documentation with his department. Florence wrote back the same day she received the letter and spent the next several months in a rich scientific correspondence that seemed to increase her energy rather than consume it. Elias watched her work with a feeling that was part admiration and part something quieter, the deep satisfaction of seeing the person you love doing what they were made for in the world. In the summer of their second year together, Florence told him she was pregnant. She told him in the morning, very simply, sitting across the breakfast table, because Florence was not a woman who built to things with ceremony unless the thing itself required it. He looked at her for a moment, and then got up and came around the table and knelt beside her chair and put his arms around her. And he did not say anything for a long time, because he was not capable of saying anything that matched the feeling. And she put her hand on the back of his head and held him there, and they stayed that way in the morning light of the cabin, while the creek ran outside and the valley held them in its quiet. Their son was born in February of 1876, during a snowstorm that managed to be simultaneously inconvenient and beautiful. Elias had ridden to fetch the midwife from the settlement at the canyon's mouth 3 weeks before the expected time, which Florence had called excessive, but had not actually objected to. The midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Aldrich who had delivered most of the babies in the county for 20 years, was in residence in the spare room Thomas had built before he left for Utah, and she and Florence had long established a mutual respect, which helped considerably. The boy arrived at 4 in the morning with more noise than Elias had expected, and a vigorous insistence on existing that made Mrs. Aldrich laugh. He had dark hair like Elias and the particular determined set to his brow that Florence carried when she was concentrating, and he was healthy and loud and absolutely himself from the first moment. They named him James, for Florence's father, with Elias as his middle name, James Elias Underwood. Florence held him and looked at Elias over the baby's head with an expression that he would keep in his memory for the rest of his life, because it was everything she was and everything she felt, and it was entirely directed at him, and it was the most precious thing anyone had ever given him. Thomas came back in the spring, brown from the Utah sun and full of stories, and met his nephew with a delight that was entirely unguarded and completely characteristic. He had come back with something else too, a direction. The survey work had convinced him that his real calling was engineering, and he had applied and been accepted to study at a college in San Francisco. He stayed the summer, helping with the construction of a larger barn that the expanding cattle operation required, and then said goodbye to the valley in August with the air of a man who was sad to leave but certain of where he was going. "Come back when you are done," Elias told him at the canyon passage. "I will bring the whole city with me if Florence is not careful," Thomas said, and Florence, with James on her hip, laughed and said she would take the risk. The years that followed built themselves the way good years do, not in grand gestures or dramatic turns, but in the layering of ordinary days that become extraordinary in their sum. The cattle operation grew steadily and carefully, never more than the land could support, and Elias' partnership with Gideon Walsh expanded to include supplying remount horses to the cavalry at Fort Churchill, which was solid, reliable work. They were not wealthy in the way that the silver barons were wealthy, but they were comfortable, which in 1876 and 1877 and 1878 in Nevada felt like its own kind of fortune. Florence's scientific reputation grew alongside the cattle operation. Dr. Hartmann published her valley survey as a monograph through the university, and it was reviewed in 2 separate scientific journals, one in San Francisco and one in Boston. She received a letter from a woman naturalist in England, a Mrs. Wren, who wrote to say that the work was remarkable and that she had shared it with colleagues at the Natural History Museum in London. Florence read that letter at least 4 times before she put it down. "I think your valley is about to become famous," Elias told her. "Our valley," she said, and she said it with a quiet certainty that made it feel like the most important correction she had ever made. When James was 2, Elias built a proper dedicated workroom onto the south side of the cabin for Florence, a room with 3 large windows for light and shelves built to her specifications, and a proper writing desk of the kind she had always worked around the edges of wanting. He did it with Thomas's engineering advice by correspondence, and with the help of a carpenter from Carson City, who built the window frames to Florence's particular requirements for maximum natural illumination. He surprised her with it on a morning in March when the light was coming in from the south, and it lit the room like something out of a painting. She stood in the door of the room for a long time without saying anything, and Elias stood behind her and waited. "This is the most generous thing anyone has ever done for me," she said finally. "You do work that matters," he said. "You should have a proper place to do it." She turned around and looked at him, and she had been his wife for 3 years by then, and he still looked at her, and felt the same thing he had felt the first time she had stepped onto the porch with a rifle in her hands. That sense of encountering something rare and particular and worth stopping for. She kissed him with the directness that was entirely her, and he held her in the doorway of the new room in the March sunlight. And James came tottering across the yard, toward them, making the sounds of a 2-year-old who had decided that whatever was happening required his participation. And Elias scooped him up without breaking the embrace, and James promptly grabbed a handful of his father's shirt and was satisfied. In the summer of 1878, something happened that required both of them to be more than what they had needed to be before. A drought hit the canyon country with a severity that had not been seen in a decade. The creek dropped to a trickle, the garden suffered, and the grass in the grazing canyons browned and thinned in ways that threatened to set back the cattle operation seriously. The irrigation system Florence had built was not sufficient for the reduced water flow. They spent a week working together on the problem, Elias with his knowledge of the land and Florence with her understanding of the valley's hydrology from years of study. She had noted in her records, accumulated over 5 years, the exact locations of springs and seeps throughout the canyon system, some of which had never been documented but which she had observed during her surveys. Together they mapped a rerouting of the main irrigation channel that connected to 2 secondary springs that Elias had not known existed, and the result was not a restoration of what they had had before but a more efficient system that actually handled low water periods better than the original. "Your father would have been delighted by this," Elias said one afternoon, looking at what they had built. Florence, who was kneeling by the new channel checking the flow rate, looked up. "He would have argued about the engineering," she said. "He always argued with me about engineering. He thought I was too experimental. Was he right?" She looked at the water running in the channel, sufficient and steady, and feeding the garden and the stock troughs in the creek below. "Not today," she said. "The drought broke in October with the kind of rain that Nevada produced after a long dry spell, dramatic and sudden and deeply welcome. The creek rose quickly, and the valley greened up in ways that seemed, in the wet gray light, like a kind of forgiveness." Elias stood on the porch with Florence beside him, and watched the rain come down on the cottonwoods and the canyon walls, and felt the particular contentment of a man who has survived something difficult alongside someone equal to it. In the spring of 1879, Florence discovered what she had been suspecting was a new species of flowering plant in the far north end of the canyon system. It was a small plant, unremarkable to an untrained eye, but its structure was unlike any documented species in her reference books, and when she wrote to Dr. Hartman, he replied within 3 weeks with considerable excitement and the suggestion that she prepare a formal description for publication. The taxonomic process was lengthy and involved correspondence with 3 other botanists over the following months, but by the end of the year the consensus was established, and the plant was formally described in the Journal of the Botanical Society of America as a new species. It was named, at Dr. Hartman's suggestion and Florence's acceptance, Linanthus hawthornae. She brought the published journal page to show Elias at the barn, where he was working on a piece of tack, and he read it carefully and then looked up at her. "Your name in the scientific record," he said. "My father's name too," she said. "Hawthorne. He always said the land would remember him better than any headstone." Her voice was even, but her eyes were bright. "I think he was right." Elias set down the tack and took the journal from her hands and looked at the page again, and then he said something quietly that she held close for the rest of her life. "He would have been so proud of you," he said. "Anyone who knew you would be. I am, every single day." She took the journal back from him, and then his hand, and held it, there in the barn with the horses moving gently in their stalls and the canyon light coming through the wide door. By the time James was 5 years old, the valley had begun to feel like the kind of place that has always existed in exactly the form it now occupied. The cabin had grown, the workroom, the larger barn, a proper guest room that Thomas used when he came back from San Francisco for summers. Now a graduate student in civil engineering who talked at dinner about water systems and bridge construction in ways that would have baffled Elias 3 years earlier, but which now made perfect sense. Florence and Elias had added a proper porch that wrapped around the south and west sides of the cabin, and in the evenings they sat on it together after James was in bed, watching the canyon walls go through their daily performance of color change. Rose to amber to deep purple to the extraordinary dark blue of desert dusk. It was on the porch one such evening in August of 1880 that Florence told him she was pregnant again. He was not caught off guard this time in the sense that they had spoken about it, had wanted it, had hoped for it, and yet the telling of it still managed to land with the same profound weight as the first time, the sense of the world enlarging. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Very well," she said. "Better than with James, I think. More settled." "You are always settled," he said. "I was terrified with James and I simply did not show it," she said, which was entirely true and which he believed immediately. "This time I am not terrified." "Because you have done it before," he said. "Because I have you," she said simply. Their second child was a girl, born in April of 1881, on a morning that was all blue sky and the smell of sage after spring rain. She was smaller than James had been, with her mother's auburn hair and what appeared to be Elias' gray eyes, which Florence found genuinely amusing because she had always liked his eyes. They named her Elias Underwood Ada for a gray tan of Elias, who had been the first person to tell him that books mattered, and Elias because Florence had always loved the sound of it. Ada was a quieter baby than James had been, but what she lacked in volume she compensated for in alertness. She watched the world from her very first days with an attention that everyone who held her commented on, and Florence, who observed closely for a living, said that the child was going to be a scientist. She could already tell. "You may be biased," Elias said. "Completely biased," she agreed. "Does that change whether it is true?" He recognized his own words and laughed, and she laughed with him, in the kitchen of the cabin with Ada in her arms and James pulling on Elias' trouser leg, demanding to see his sister again, because he was 4.5 years old, and entirely convinced that the baby was primarily there for his entertainment. James Elias Underwood, at 4.5, was large for his age and had both his parents' most useful qualities, his father's patience and his mother's precision, and not many of their less useful ones, which boded well. He was determined about everything he undertook and gentle with his sister from the very beginning in a way that made Mrs. Aldrich, who came to check on Florence in the days after the birth, say that he had been raised right, which was the highest compliment she gave anyone. Thomas came that summer with his engineering degree finished and several offers of employment, and spent 2 months helping to plan the expansion of the main cabin that Elias had been considering. The workroom had been joined over the years by an additional sleeping room and a proper pantry, but the family was now 4, and the cabin needed to grow further. Thomas designed a full east wing with 3 rooms and a proper indoor storage space, and between him and Elias and a carpenter hired from Carson City, they built it over 6 weeks of summer that were both hard work and something approaching a reunion that none of them quite said the word for. Thomas left in September with a position in Sacramento on a significant public waterworks project. He left with the understanding, clear on all sides, that the valley was home and would remain home, and that he would come back as often as work allowed. The valley in the autumn of 1881 was different from the valley in the autumn of 1872, which was the last autumn it had been fully alone. It was inhabited now in the way that places become inhabited when people love them truly, not burdened, not changed beyond recognition, but deepened. Elias had added stock and expanded the grazing carefully without damaging the land. Florence had documented every significant species and formation in the canyon system and had sent specimens to 3 universities. The creek ran clear, and the cottonwoods went gold every fall, and the garden produced more than the family could eat. So they brought the excess to the settlement at the canyon mouth, and to a Paiute family who had always lived and foraged in the wider canyon country, a family who had been there long before any of the settlers and who had been willing, after a year of cautious approach on Elias' part and genuine respect established over time, to share knowledge of the land that no survey map could have recorded: the location of springs, the seasonal patterns of water, the plants with medicinal uses that Florence had eventually documented properly in exchange for their names in the Paiute language being recorded alongside the Latin ones. It was not enough, in the face of everything that had been taken from indigenous peoples across the West, and Elias and Florence both understood that and said it to each other plainly. The land under the canyon claim had once been their territory entirely, and the law that made it now Hawthorne property was a law with injustice built into its foundation. What they could do was treat the family with respect, maintain a relationship of genuine exchange rather than charity, and make clear that the land would not be sold or developed in ways that would end their access to it. It was not a solution, but it was the honest effort of 2 people trying to do the right thing within the limits of what they could change. By the winter of 1882, Elias had been still in one place for 9 years. He sometimes thought about this at odd moments, in the saddle checking on the cattle, or in the evenings on the porch, and was always surprised by how unconfining it felt. He had been afraid of staying when he was young. He had thought that staying meant stopping, and stopping meant defeat of some kind, the giving up of possibilities. What he had found instead was that staying in the right place with the right person was its own kind of motion, its own kind of discovery. The valley kept changing with the seasons and the years. Florence kept finding new things in it. James was learning to read with a speed that alarmed and delighted both of them. Ada was pulling herself upright against the furniture and looking at everything with those large, attentive eyes as if she were cataloging it. Nothing was stopped. Everything was building. One morning in February, Elias rode out to the cottonwood tree on the main road on some errand or other, and he pulled up beside it and looked at the empty spike that was still in the bark after 9 years, just a small iron spike, going rusty now, half absorbed by the tree's growth. He sat his horse for a moment and looked at it. He thought about a man who had no particular reason to stop and had stopped anyway. He thought about curiosity and what it opened. He thought about a map drawn in careful, precise lines on good quality paper, and a valley hidden in canyon country, and a woman standing on a porch with a rifle in her hands and flower on her arm, and an expression that said she would handle whatever the world brought her, and had been doing so for long enough that she had forgotten what it was like to have someone to handle it with. He reached out and touched the old spike. Then he turned his horse and rode back through the canyon passage into the valley, where Florence was at her work table in the bright south-facing workroom, with Ada on a blanket at her feet, eating a biscuit, and James at the table doing his letters. And the coffee pot was on the stove making the particular sound it made before it was quite ready. And the February light was coming in through the 3 large windows and making the geological specimens on the shelves glow amber and rose. He came in and kissed Florence on the top of her head, and she reached up without looking away from her work and put her hand briefly against his jaw, the way she had come to do. And James said his name and held up a paper covered in letters. And Ada looked up from the blanket with her serious gray eyes and held up the biscuit, which was apparently an offering or a greeting or possibly both. He picked Ada up and sat down beside Florence and looked at James's letters and said they were very good, which they were, and helped himself to half of Ada's biscuit, which she surrendered with evident philosophy. Outside, the valley held everything it had always held, plus 9 years of living and building and discovering. The creek ran over its stones. The cottonwoods were bare in the winter, but the spring was already somewhere in the cold air, gathering itself for the return. The canyon walls told their old story in colored stone, and in the workroom on the shelves, Florence's specimens and drawings and published papers told a newer story alongside it. The story of a woman who had come to this hidden place with her father's claim and her own fierce intelligence, and had made it into something the world would know about. And at the table, Elias Underwood sat in the home he had found by following a map nailed to the wrong tree, with his daughter on his knee and his wife's shoulder warm against his arm, and his son reading his letters aloud in the careful, deliberate voice of a child proving something to himself. And he was, in the most complete and uncomplicated way he had ever managed in his life, exactly where he was supposed to be. The story that began with a spike in a cottonwood tree and a map flapping in the Nevada wind had not ended. It had simply, quietly, become a life. And outside the cabin, in the spring that was still gathering itself, the first caddisfly larvae of the year turned in the cold water of the creek in the canyon that no one was passing through on their way somewhere else, because everything that mattered had already arrived.